After 20 years or more of writing poetry, I'm really not completely sure of the answer to that question. For me, poems are magical creatures. The inspiration for my poems seemed to come organically from whatever is going on that particular day. An event I'm privileged to be a part of, a question that occurs to me, something out of thin air, a sound, an amazing picture, a word I hear or a phrase that intrigues me, makes me feel as though I must know more about that subject. I need to examine it, to explain it. I'm almost never very far away from a small notebook and a pencil. If I'm lucky and the poetry muse jumps upon my shoulder and stays and refuses to leave until the poem is begun, then I know that poem is going to get written. Once a line or a title or a word gets a hold of me, I can continue my workday. My brain and my muse begins writing the poem without my conscious self. I would say that for me, writing it was a war between the assignment and the inspiration. I don't see myself as a poet who can write poetry from a place of stress or the fear of a deadline. In the case of the poem I wrote to Caroline's painting, as using that as an inspiration, it really became as a deadline and a fear of the work that had to be done. In the late 2019s, I was involved in two shared art experiences. An acrostic poem is an ancient art. It's simply finding a way to verbalize, to visualize words. So, as part of an acrostic event, the poet sees a painting and writes a poem to that painting. A painter or a sculptor, a potter looks at the poem, reads the poem, and then creates a piece of art to them. I've been involved 3 or 4 of those events over the years. But when this series of events came up in the end of 2019, I had just finished a book about Vietnam, and I had not written poetry for several years. And I have to say that I really missed the pleasure of just being creative, something that nonfiction writing doesn't always allow you. So over the 5 years of putting this nonfiction book together, the Poetry Muse, I've often visited, but I found shifting back to writing poetry to be very difficult. The nonfiction book required a different part of my brain, so I would just flick her off my shoulder and tell her to come back in another day or in another year when I needed her. When the need arose to write a poem, she was nowhere to be found. In November of 2019, I found myself with an assignment to write not just one poem, but 3. The Muse and I needed to look at these 3 paintings and quickly draw from the zillions of ideas, the zillions of words in the universe, and come up with 3 very distinct, beautiful poems. Easy to ask, beyond the impossible to accomplish, I discovered. 2 of the poems that I needed to write were part of a program for something called cross-pollination, which was an event being put on by one of the women's groups that I belong to, and the event itself would be showcased in March of 2020. It, of course, was canceled because of the coronavirus. I also had the pleasure to be one of the many artists included in something we call in Albuquerque the Sense of Wonder experience, which should have had its beginning in an opening in April of 2020. But again, this event was canceled due to the virus. So I needed to complete that poem by the end of December. November was a very busy month for me, and I had several deadlines coming up in December, but my head was working on how to write these 3 poems, and I couldn't get started on any one of the 3 of them. All 3 paintings I had taken a photograph of and I had in my computer. So on a particular day, I opened up a file with a photo of Caroline's painting. I have to admit, I left that one till last because at first glance of the picture, I chose not to work off of it right away because it seemed dark and foreboding, and it didn't give me that warm feeling that I thought I needed to write a beautiful poem. When I looked at it, there was obviously no white fluffy clouds of inspiration waiting for me. But when I actually looked at the painting as a whole, I was amazed at what Caroline had captured. As I looked from the base of the painting upwards to the skyline, I felt emotions beginning to fester. They forced me to travel the colors, the movement of the painting. They exposed to me a tumultuousness of words that I'd not even been able to express a moment before. The complete poem, the idea of what I wanted to express, sort of came to me. But the actual writing of the poem took me weeks. I don't know exactly what I expected in October or during the summer of that year as about what the paintings would bring in me or what the poems would eventually look like. But I found magic in the world of words. I was so glad to be back there. They allowed me to express not only how her painting affected me, but how a poem like Awaiting My Muse is sometimes written. The first stanza of the poem that you can see expresses for me the poet's feeling of being consumed by the inability to write the poem, while the muse insists, captures the poet's thoughts and forces ideas up into the consciousness of the poet, who then can put it down on paper. The second stanza describes the moments the words begin their liberation from the page. This can be painful. As you discard ideas, you edit what seems to be a moment ago the perfect way to express what it was, the idea that works perfect within the framework of the poem, and then delete that entire idea and search again for what is the perfect words. The third stanza allows the poem to congeal into what the poet actually wants to express. The fourth stanza, or in this particular poem, is one line, is for me always the surprise. That uncomfortable, honest insight gained by the poet about the poem, from the poem. I like to call it a nakedness the poet is willing to share with the reader.